what I want to do is start talking about how a crime scene is done, kind of start to finish. This is how the typical major crime scene. What I want to talk about is here's a scene that we're going to call everybody in, maybe call in more than one CSI. It's a major scene. So we're going to cover the entire process of crime scene investigation from the initial call through finalizing the crime scene reports. And we're not normally involved at the very beginning. The hashtag now that's going around in forensics is last responder. This last responder hashtag is about us because normally we're last to respond or second to last. Now, if we're second to last, who do you think is last? It's the coroner. So if it's a coroner case, they are the last ones because they take the body when we say it's okay. But we'll get to that later. So things happen before you and I get there. But we need to know exactly what is supposed to be done before we get there. It's very important because when we show up, if some things have been missed before we get there, it can harm our investigation. A real quick example, the need of a search warrant. That's normally not something we do. That's what the detective does. So the detective is there before you, and if there's a need for a search warrant, he or she needs to get a search warrant before you can process the scene. But what if the detective goes, I think I'm supposed to be doing something, but I can't remember what it is, and they don't get a search warrant? You show up and you just process the scene. And then later someone goes, hey, did we have a search warrant? Guess what? In that evidence suppression hearing, all of that can be thrown out. And if any of that is the basis for something else that's done, that gets thrown out too. It's called the fruit of the poisonous tree. So we need to know what needs to be done so we can go, do we have a search warrant? Has this been done? And so forth. And then we can process our scene in confidence. So let's look at this series. There are actually 4 major phases of a crime scene investigation. What are these 4 phases? First phase is arriving at the scene, the initial response and prioritization of efforts. The second phase is the preliminary documentation and evaluation of the scene. This is when we actually show up, is during the second phase. The third major phase is the processing of the scene. That's all about us. And then the fourth phase we're involved in is completing and recording the crime scene investigation. So I'm going to go over each of these phases, tell you who's responsible for what, so that when we're done, we all know who is supposed to be doing what. Now, this is what is recommended in the United States. That doesn't mean that if you go to work someplace that they're going to do things differently. And it'll be a tweak, or they might call things a little differently, but it should be very close to what you see here. So let's start with arriving at the scene, the initial response, and putting efforts into priority. This is involving mostly the first responders. So what do we have? Well, these are the things that are done in the first phase. The initial response, receipt of information, safety procedures, emergency care, secure and control persons at the scene, boundaries, identifying, establishing, protecting, and securing boundaries, turning over control of the scene and brief investigators in charge, documenting actions and observations, establishing a command post and making notifications, and managing witnesses. These are all the things that have to be done in this first phase, and it's normally done by the first responders. And they should have training in this. So that first item was initial response, receipt of information. One of the most important aspects of securing the crime scene is to preserve the scene with minimal contamination and disturbance of physical evidence. So how do we do that? Well, the initial responding officer upon arrival shall assess the scene and treat the incident as a crime scene. Sometimes we don't know if it's a crime scene, such as a suicide. Many things that appear to be a suicide end up being a homicide. So we treat it as a crime scene. They shall promptly yet cautiously approach and enter the scene, remaining observant of any persons, vehicles, events, potential evidence, and environmental conditions. And so they're going to be noting things like smells they might notice. Is there a smell of gas? They need to stay alert. They need to be cognizant of officer safety as well as the integrity of a potential crime scene. They're going to err on the side of officer safety, obviously, but through training, they should be thinking of also protecting the crime scene. The second item was safety procedures. The safety and physical well-being of officers and other individuals in and around the crime scene are the initial responding officer's first priority. So the initial responding officer arriving at the scene shall identify and control any dangerous situations or persons. The next point was emergency care. After controlling any dangerous situations or persons, the initial responding officer's next responsibility is to ensure that medical attention is provided to injured persons while minimizing contamination of the scene. So they checked any possible victims for signs of life, medical needs, provide immediate medical attention. They call for medical personnel if necessary. When a medical personnel respond, they guide those medical personnel to the injured person in a way that's going to least contaminate the crime scene. Also, secure and control persons at the scene, controlling, identifying, and removing persons at the crime scene, and limiting the number of persons who enter the crime scene. And the movement of those such persons is an important function of the initial responding officer in protecting the crime scene. So they need to make sure that they don't have people trampling through the crime scene, people that are unnecessary, and so forth. With suspects, they secure and separate suspects. Witnesses, they secure and separate them. One thing you don't want to see them do is have all the witnesses standing together waiting to be interviewed, because they're going to start talking to each other. And, one person is going to say, I saw this. And the other person says, oh, is that what I saw? And then eventually it becomes more of a consensus. And when you interview them, their stories are going to be more of a blend than individual perceptions. And then suspects, we want to separate them. Any bystanders, they should determine whether or not they're witnesses. And if they are, secure and separate them. If not, get them out of the scene. And then you can have family, friends. You need to control that, showing compassion, and even control your supervisors from going into crime scenes as is prudent. So that's another thing that the initial responder needs to do. Very important thing also is to identify, establish, protect, and secure the boundaries. The initial responding officer at the scene conducts an initial assessment of the extent of the crime scene and then establishes and controls its boundaries. Now, how's that often done? Well, we've all seen the yellow crime scene tape. So that's often the way it's done, but sometimes it can just be closing a door. Maybe it's a hotel room. You're not necessarily going to put crime scene tape around the entire hotel, though in some cases that might be the right thing to do. You have to make a judgment here. Often, the initial responders make this crime scene boundary too small. When I get to a crime scene, one of the first things I do is look to see where the tape is and then decide, do I need to move it further back? And often that's really important and you do it. Another really nice technique is to actually have a second barrier. So it's a little hard to see in this picture, but there is one tape right there. And then you see all these police cars and vans and stuff. You see all the lights on top. And here's a second tape. Well, what is that all about? If I go to a crime scene and there's one tape up and it seems to be sufficient, and it's a major scene, I'm going to put up a second tape further out. And it makes a little bit of a no man's land. That's where we can put our command post. That's where we can put our break area. That's where we can put a table for packaging evidence. That's where we can confer. You don't really want the press right up at your crime scene tape. So if you have a second tape further away, now they're back further and you have a little more of a comfort zone. Also, maybe the chief of police is going to show up. Well, you can invite the chief of police past the first crime scene tape, but you don't let them go into the secured scene where they could contaminate things. That's why you would often put up a second tape. The next thing is that the initial responder will end up doing is at some point turning control of the scene over to an investigator. And when they do that, they need to brief the investigator. So what has happened up to this point? What do we have? What have I observed? What have I done? The investigator then gets all of that information so that the investigator can then start making the correct decisions following that. The initial responder is still going to be there after doing this and will remain to give crime scene security until there's some point where he or she could be relieved. And then that initial responder or responders, they need to document everything they've done. So they're going to write down everything that they in their notes. They're going to have a report. The first officer or one of the first officers on the scene may even write up the face sheet of the crime report with the main information. And then all the supplemental work is done by the detective and the CSIs and the lab. It's added to that. Or in some cases, the detective does the face sheet. It just depends on what the department wants. And it may depend on how severe the crime is. You know, on lesser crimes, the responding officer does a face sheet. Major scenes, the detective does a face sheet, and the responding officer just does a supplemental report. These are the things I did. And things they noticed, you know, were windows opened, doors standing open, gates open, on and on. Those things need to all be recorded by the initial responder. They're not done yet. They need to establish a command post in many cases. That's where that no man's land would be a nice place to put it. This is the command post. It could be the trunk of a police car, or maybe they have a command post van. That's where you set up shop. And usually the first responder will have that as one of the things they are responsible for doing. And then they are also going to need to manage witnesses. They may be the ones that do the interviews, or if there's more than one detective, sometimes the detective will do the interviews. But then that all has to be taken care of as well. So that's the first of the 4 phases. All right, so that's done by the responding officers quite typically.